There's something almost magical about a perfect crime. Not the violence, not the greed, but the sheer audacity of imagination required to look at an impossible situation and find a way through it. The evening of May 15th, 1855 began like any other Tuesday in London. The city was alive with the sounds of industry and progress, the great railway stations serving as temples to Victorian ambition and engineering prowess. At London Bridge Station, railway workers moved with practiced efficiency, loading mail bags, securing luggage, and preparing the evening mail train for its journey to Folkestone. Among the cargo being loaded that night were 3 wooden boxes, unremarkable in appearance, but extraordinary in content. Inside those boxes sat gold bullion and coins worth £12,000, an amount equivalent to roughly £1.4 million in modern currency. The gold belonged to 3 separate bullion dealers, Abel and Company, Messrs. Bolt and Company, and Adam Spielman and Company. Each had prepared their shipments with meticulous care, weighing the gold precisely, sealing the wooden boxes with their company seals, and binding each box tightly with iron bands. The carriers, Chaplin and Company, had collected these boxes and brought them to London Bridge, where they would be locked inside special iron traveling safes manufactured by the renowned locksmith firm Chubb & Son. These were no ordinary safes. Constructed from steel 1 inch thick, each safe featured 2 sets of identical locks, and the security protocol demanded that no single individual ever have access to both keys simultaneously. One key was held by trusted railway staff at London Bridge, while the other remained with personnel at Folkestone. Even the captain of the cross-channel steamer would need both keys to access the contents. It was a system designed to be foolproof. The gold was destined for Paris, where it would be deposited in the vaults of the Banque de France. The journey would take it first by rail to Folkestone, then across the English Channel by steamer to Boulogne, and finally by French railway to the Gare du Nord in Paris. It was a routine shipment, one of many that moved along this route, facilitating the flow of capital and commerce that powered the expanding European economy. Gold shipments were so common that they had become mundane, just another piece of cargo to be transported alongside mail bags and passenger luggage. That mundane quality would prove to be both the system's greatest strength and ultimately its fatal weakness. As the 8:30 evening mail train prepared to depart London Bridge that night, the guard on duty was a man named James Burgess. At first glance, Burgess appeared to be the very model of a reliable railway employee. He had worked for the Southeastern Railway since 1843, when the company first began running the Folkestone line. 12 years of faithful service had made him a familiar and trusted face among the station staff. He was married, thrifty, respectable, the sort of man who inspired confidence. What his employers didn't know was that James Burgess had a grievance. Like many railwaymen of that era, Burgess had seen his wages reduced as the initial railway boom of the 1840s gave way to harder economic times. The resentment festered quietly, making him receptive to a proposition that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier. That evening, as Burgess went about his duties preparing the guard's van, 2 gentlemen purchased first-class tickets to Folkestone. One was a large-faced man in his late 30s wearing what witnesses would later describe as a loud waistcoat and fancy trousers. His name was William Pierce, and though he appeared to be just another passenger, he was in fact the architect of what was about to unfold. Pierce had worked for the Southeastern Railway himself until he was dismissed for gambling. Rather than finding legitimate employment elsewhere, Pierce had become a ticket printer in a betting shop, but his true occupation had become something far more elaborate. He spent his evenings in the pubs and beer shops around London Bridge, the same establishments frequented by railway employees, and over countless pints of ale. He had gathered intelligence, piece by piece, about the gold shipments. The other gentleman was Pierce's companion, Edward Agar, a man just under 40 years old who carried himself with quiet confidence. Unlike Pierce, Agar made no pretense about his background. He was a professional criminal, a career thief who had been working since he was 18 years old. He had spent a decade in Australia and the United States before returning to Britain in 1853. And he had returned as a wealthy man, with £3,000 in government bonds and a fashionable house called Cambridge Villa in Shepherd's Bush. Agar possessed skills that Pierce lacked. He was a safe cracker, a screwsman as they were known in criminal circles, someone who understood locks and keys with an artist's intuition. The two men handed their carpetbags to Burgess, who dutifully stored them in the guard's van alongside the iron safes containing the gold. Pierce took his seat in a first-class compartment, settling in as though preparing for an ordinary journey. But Agar did not join him. Instead, as the platform cleared and the final boarding calls were made, Agar slipped quietly into the guard's van and concealed himself in a corner covered by Burgess's spare overalls. The train's whistle blew, steam hissed from the locomotive, and the evening mail service began its journey toward the Kent coast. The moment the train pulled away from London Bridge Station, Agar emerged from his hiding place and set to work. Burgess had draped a cape over the windows of the guard's van, ensuring that the engine crew could not see inside. In the dim, swaying compartment, lit only by a small oil lamp, Agar opened one of the carpet bags and withdrew a set of tools. Among them were the keys that he and Pierce had spent months creating, keys that represented hundreds of hours of careful planning and nerve-wracking risk. The story of how those keys came to exist reveals the true genius and audacity of the crime. It had begun more than a year earlier, in May of 1854, when Pierce first approached Agar with the idea of robbing the gold shipments. Agar's initial response had been dismissive. He told Pierce it would be impossible unless they could somehow obtain impressions of the keys to the safes. Pierce had replied that he thought he knew how that could be arranged. The problem was that the keys were kept separately and were rarely available for the time needed to make proper copies. This was where the fourth member of their conspiracy entered the picture. William Tester was a well-educated man who wore a monocle and worked as a clerk in the traffic department at London Bridge Station, serving as assistant to the superintendent. This position gave Tester access to crucial information about which guards would be on duty on any given night and when valuable shipments were being made. More importantly, it occasionally gave him access to one of the keys. When repairs were being done to the iron safes, when boxes needed to be loaded or unloaded outside of the normal schedule, Tester could legitimately handle the key for brief periods. In the summer of 1854, Tester had arranged for two of the iron chests to be sent to Chubb & Son for repairs, claiming that locks had seized up. When the chests were returned in October of that year, Tester found himself in possession of one of the keys for longer than usual. He alerted Pierce and Agar came to the station with small blocks of wax concealed on his person. In a moment, when he was unobserved, Agar pressed the key into the wax, taking impressions from multiple angles. In his nervous haste, he made a mistake, creating duplicate impressions of the same key rather than impressions of both keys. But this setback only delayed the plan rather than derailing it. Obtaining an impression of the second key required even more elaborate deception. Pierce and Agar traveled to Folkestone to observe the operation at that end of the line. They spent so much time watching the station and the pier that they attracted the attention of both the Southeastern Railway's police force and the Folkestone Borough Police. Pierce had to leave town after being recognized by an inspector who had previously arrested him for ticket fraud. But Agar remained, drinking in the Rose Inn near the pier, befriending railway workers, watching and learning. He discovered that the second key was kept locked in a cabinet at the railway offices on Folkestone Pier. Getting access to that key required another ingenious scheme. Agar essentially staged a fake gold delivery, presenting himself as a courier with a shipment that needed to be secured. In the confusion of the moment, with clerks distracted and Agar playing his role convincingly, he managed to get his hands on the second key long enough to press it into wax. With impressions of both keys finally obtained, Agar and Pierce could begin the painstaking work of creating functioning duplicates. Over the following months, Agar made 7 or 8 trial runs on the Folkestone route when Burgess was on duty, each time refining the keys, testing them in the locks, making minute adjustments until they worked smoothly and silently. This was the work of a true craftsman. The slightest imperfection could cause a key to jam or make noise, alerting guards or passengers. Agar worked on those keys with the dedication of a sculptor, perfecting a masterpiece. While Agar refined the keys, he and Pierce made other preparations. They visited the shot tower in Lambeth, a tall brick structure where lead shot was manufactured for hunting firearms. There they purchased 2 long hundredweight, about 220 pounds, of lead shot. They acquired courier bags that could be strapped under a cloak, concealing their contents, and sturdy carpet bags for carrying heavy loads. Every detail was planned with precision. They would need to match the weight of the gold they stole with an equal weight of lead shot, ensuring that any cursory weighing of the boxes would not reveal the theft. By May of 1855, everything was ready. They simply needed to wait for a shipment large enough to justify the risk. Tester had altered the duty rosters to ensure Burgess would be working the evening mail service throughout the month. A signal system was established. Every evening, either Agar or Pierce would wait outside London Bridge Station. If a gold shipment was being made that night, Burgess would walk out of the station and wipe his face with a white handkerchief. That simple gesture would set the entire plan in motion. On the evening of May 15th, Burgess gave the signal. Within hours, Agar found himself crouched in the swaying guard's van, working by lamplight as the train raced through the darkness toward Red Hill. He used one of his duplicate keys to open the first iron safe. To his relief, only one of the 2 locks had been secured, a common shortcut taken by railway staff, despite official protocols. The safe opened without difficulty. Inside the safe were wooden boxes bound with iron bands. Rather than attempting to force open the locks on the boxes themselves, Agar used a different approach. With pincers, he carefully removed the rivets holding the iron bands in place. Then, using wooden wedges inserted from the reverse side, he pried open the back of the box, leaving the front with its official seals apparently intact. Inside the first box, sent by Abel and Company, were gold bars from Australia. Agar removed each bar, weighed it on a small scale he had brought, and replaced it with an equal weight of lead shot. When the box was empty of gold, he nailed the iron bands back in place and resealed the front of the box. Here, Agar demonstrated remarkable audacity and skill. The official seals of the bullion dealers were crucial evidence that the boxes had not been tampered with. Rather than simply removing them, Agar had prepared counterfeit seals using dies he had made himself. In the dim lighting of the Folkestone station platform at night, he gambled correctly that these forgeries would pass a cursory inspection. He was betting that no one would examine the seals closely until the boxes reached Paris, by which time the trail would be hopelessly cold. The train reached Red Hill 35 minutes after leaving London Bridge. When it stopped, Agar once again hid himself, while Tester, who had boarded the train in a third-class carriage with the blinds drawn, received a bag containing some of the stolen gold from Burgess. Tester immediately returned to London by another route, ensuring that he would be seen at the Southeastern Railway offices, establishing an alibi. Meanwhile, Pierce left his first-class compartment and joined Agar and Burgess in the guard's van. With Pierce now assisting, the work proceeded more quickly. The second box from Adam Spielman and Company contained hundreds of American Gold Eagle coins, each worth $10. These were removed, weighed, and replaced with lead shot. The third box from Messrs. Bolt and Company contained more gold bars, but here the conspirators encountered a problem. These bars weighed more than the lead shot they had remaining. Rather than leave the box obviously lighter than it should be, they made a difficult decision. They left some of the gold bars inside, taking only what they could replace with lead shot. When they rebanded this final box, it sustained some damage, but they repaired it as best they could in the cramped, moving compartment. When the train approached Folkestone around 10:30 in the evening, Agar and Pierce hid themselves once more while railway staff removed the iron safes from the guard's van. Once the safes were gone, the two men emerged, passing through the train until they reached the first-class carriages, where they sat as though they had been there all along. The train continued to Dover, where Agar and Pierce finally disembarked, collected their now heavy carpet-bags from Burgess, and walked calmly to a nearby hotel for supper. Before they ate, Agar threw the duplicate keys and his burglary tools into the sea, eliminating the most damning evidence. In the early hours of the morning, they boarded the 2 o'clock train back to London, arriving around 5 in the morning. They had successfully stolen 224 pounds of gold, worth £12,000. The real brilliance of the crime became apparent over the following hours. When the steamer carrying the iron safes arrived in Boulogne, a crew member noticed that the boxes inside appeared damaged. But since staff at Folkestone had not mentioned any problems, he saw no cause for concern. The boxes were weighed at Boulogne, and that was when the first hint of trouble emerged. The box from Abel and Company weighed 40 pounds less than it had in London, while the other two boxes weighed slightly more than their recorded weights. This discrepancy was puzzling, but not immediately alarming. Weight measurements could vary slightly depending on the scales used, and the fact that some boxes weighed more, while others weighed less, suggested that the problem might be with the scales rather than the contents. The boxes were loaded onto a French train and transported to Paris. When they arrived at the Gare du Nord and were weighed again, the results matched those from Boulogne. Only when the boxes were finally opened did the horrifying truth emerge. Instead of gleaming gold bars and coins, the boxes contained bags of cheap lead shot. The crime was immediately recognized as extraordinary, but determining where and how it had occurred proved frustratingly difficult. The French authorities were certain the theft had occurred in England. After all, the weights of the boxes in Boulogne matched their weights in Paris, but differed from the weights recorded in London. This meant the substitution must have taken place before the boxes reached France. The British authorities, however, were equally convinced that such a theft was impossible. The boxes had been sealed, the safes locked, and the keys held by trusted employees who had been nowhere near the train during its journey. Newspapers reported that it is supposed that so well-planned a scheme could not have been executed in the rapid passage by railway from London to Folkestone. Both British and French officials declared that the crime was an impossibility. The 3 bullion merchants demanded compensation for their losses. Most of Abel's gold had been insured through the Southeastern Railway, but the company flatly denied any culpability, insisting the robbery must have taken place in France. A reward of £300 was offered for information, leading to the arrest of the thieves, but no credible leads emerged. The investigation went nowhere. Burgess was questioned, but his 14 years of loyal service to the company placed him above suspicion. Tester had been seen at the Southeastern Railway offices in London while the train was en route to Folkestone, giving him a perfect alibi. Pierce and Agar had never come to anyone's attention. On May 16th, the morning after the robbery, Pierce and Agar walked into a money changer's shop with some of the American Gold Eagle coins and received £213 for them. At a second shop, they exchanged 200 more coins for a check worth slightly over £203. They were converting their stolen gold into spendable currency with remarkable ease. There was no public alarm yet, no descriptions of missing coins circulating among merchants. The discovery in Paris had not yet been communicated to London, and even when it was, the connection between the theft and the specific coins would be nearly impossible to establish. Over the following weeks and months, Agar and Pierce worked to dispose of the rest of their haul. They melted down the gold bars in a crucible at Agar's house, Cambridge Villa, refashioning them into smaller bars that would be easier to sell. This process was not without its hazards. On one occasion, a crucible cracked, spilling molten gold onto the wooden floor of a spare bedroom and starting a small fire. The floor was left scarred and blackened, and tiny particles of gold remained embedded in the charred wood. But Agar simply covered the damage with rugs and continued his work. In June, the 4 conspirators met to divide their profits. Pierce Tester, and Agar each received £600 initially, while Burgess received £700, with the understanding that the differences would be made up in subsequent distributions. For men of their social standing, these were extraordinary sums. Burgess invested his share in Turkish bonds and shares in a brewing company called Reed and Company. Pierce used his money to open a betting shop near Covent Garden, telling friends he had won the capital by betting on a horse called Saucebox in the St. Leger Stakes at long odds. Tester purchased Spanish active bonds. All three men were careful to create plausible cover stories for their sudden wealth. A portion of the gold, about £2,500 worth, was sold to a man named James Townshend Saward, who acted as a fence. Saward was a remarkable character, a barrister and special pleader at the Inner Temple, who used his legal knowledge to plan and coordinate elaborate fraud schemes. He was known in criminal circles as Jim the Penman because of his expertise in forgery. That a respected member of the legal profession would be involved in such criminal enterprises speaks to the complexity and sophistication of the London underworld in the 1850s. For Agar, the success of the robbery should have marked the beginning of a comfortable life. He had money, he had escaped detection, and he had the satisfaction of having pulled off what many considered an impossible crime. But his personal life was beginning to unravel. Relations between Agar and his partner, Fanny Kay, deteriorated in the aftermath of the robbery. She was 23 years old, a former attendant at Tunbridge Railway Station who had been introduced to Agar by Burgess in 1853. She had borne Agar's child and moved into Cambridge Villa in December of 1854, just months before the robbery. But Agar was not faithful to her. He became involved with another woman, Emily Campbell, and by autumn of 1855, he had left Cambridge Villa to stay with Pierce while they continued processing and selling the stolen gold. Fanny Kay found herself in a difficult position. She was a single mother with a young child, abandoned by her partner with no independent source of income. She had cleaned Cambridge Villa thoroughly after Agar left, trying to erase the evidence of the work that had been done there, not fully understanding what all the equipment and materials had been for. She found a washhouse blackened with soot and a spare bedroom with a scorched floor covered in burn marks. She discovered sacks of charcoal and strange implements whose purpose she could not fathom. But she asked no questions. She simply cleaned and waited, hoping that Agar would provide for his child. Meanwhile, Agar's criminal career continued. He became involved in a check forgery scheme, working with none other than James Townshend Saward, the crooked barrister who had helped fence some of the gold. In late 1855 or early 1856, this forgery operation came to the attention of the police. Agar was arrested, and though he may have been innocent of this particular crime, his past had finally caught up with him. He was convicted and sentenced to transportation to Australia for life. As he sat in Pentonville prison awaiting the ship that would carry him to the other side of the world, Agar sent word to Pierce. He asked his former partner to look after Fanny Kay and their child, to provide them with money from Agar's share of the gold robbery proceeds. Pierce agreed. He promised he would take care of them. But Pierce had no intention of keeping that promise. He had already moved the remaining gold and Agar's money from Cambridge Villa to his own property. Rather than giving Fanny Kay the £3,000 of Agar's own money that he held, money that had nothing to do with the robbery, Pierce kept it all for himself. He sent Kay away with vague assurances and empty promises. Fanny Kay was desperate. She had no income, no support, and a young child to feed. She had already been abandoned by Agar, and now Pierce had betrayed her as well. In her desperation, she made a decision that would change everything. She went to Newgate Prison and requested an audience with the governor. When she was brought before him, she told him a remarkable story. She named names: William Pierce, James Burgess, William Tester, and Edward Agar. She told the governor about the gold robbery, about the planning and the execution, about the division of the proceeds. She did this not out of civic duty or moral principle, but out of rage and necessity. Pierce had broken his word, and now she would break his life. The prison authorities were skeptical at first. The great gold robbery had been unsolved for over a year, and here was a young woman with an implausible story about how it had been done. But her account was detailed and specific, filled with information that only someone close to the criminals could know. They brought Agar up from Pentonville prison and questioned him. At first, Agar refused to confirm Kay's story. There was still honor among thieves, at least in his mind, and he would not betray his confederates. But then the authorities told him the truth. Pierce had not given Fanny Kay any money. He had kept everything for himself, betraying both Agar and the mother of his child. Agar's fury was immediate and absolute. If Pierce would not honor his obligations, then Agar saw no reason to protect him. Agar signed a confession and began cooperating fully with the police. He described the entire operation in meticulous detail, from the first planning stages to the disposal of the gold. He explained how the key impressions had been obtained, how the trial runs had been conducted, how the robbery had been executed on the night of May 15th. His testimony was damning and comprehensive. On November 5, 1856, more than a year after the robbery, James Burgess was arrested at his workplace. Pierce was arrested the same evening. When police searched Pierce's property, they found a hole beneath the pantry steps. Inside that hole was the remaining stolen gold. Investigators then traveled to Cambridge Villa in Shepherd's Bush. There they found exactly what Fanny Kay had told them they would find. In the wash house, particles of gold adhered to the fire bricks. In the spare bedroom, the wooden floor bore scorch marks that glittered when light was shone on them. These were the physical remnants of the crime, the traces that Agar and Pierce had failed to completely erase. William Tester, who had left England to work as a general manager for a Swedish railway company, was ordered to return to London. When he arrived, he too was arrested. In November and December of 1856, preliminary hearings took place at the Mansion House, presided over by the Lord Mayor of London in his capacity as Chief Magistrate of the City of London. Agar attended and testified, identifying pieces of evidence and confirming the details of his written confession. When Tester was brought before the court, he had already been dismissed from his Swedish position. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the Lord Mayor rendered his decision. All three men, Pierce, Burgess, and Tester, would stand trial for the robbery. Pierce stated simply, "I have nothing at all to say. I reserve my defense." Burgess and Tester both declared, "I am not guilty." The trial took place at the Old Bailey between January 13th and 15th, 1857. It received extensive coverage in newspapers across Britain. The public was fascinated by the audacity of the crime and the complexity of its planning. Here was a robbery that had defeated the best security systems of the age, that had baffled police and railway authorities for more than a year, and that had required the betrayal of one of the criminals by his abandoned mistress to finally solve. All three defendants pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. Agar took the stand and testified against his former colleagues, openly admitting that he was a self-confessed professional criminal who had not made an honest living since the age of 18. His testimony was corroborated by an impressive parade of witnesses. John Chubb, the locksmith whose company had manufactured the safes, testified about the keys and locks. The bullion dealers described their procedures for sealing and securing the gold shipments. Transportation agents, railway staff, station personnel from London Bridge and Folkestone, customs officers from Boulogne, railway police, taverners, and hotel keepers all took the stand. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle, confirming that the four men had known each other, that they had been present together at various stages of the planning and execution, and that their movements matched Agar's account of the crime. The defense had little to work with. The physical evidence was damning. The testimony was consistent. The only real question was whether the jury would believe Agar, a confessed career criminal, over three men who had previously been considered respectable members of society. The jury deliberated briefly. They returned a verdict of guilty for all three defendants. The sentencing reflected the different roles the men had played and their relationships with the Southeastern Railway. Pierce, who had not been employed by the railway at the time of the robbery, received 2 years of hard labor in England, along with 3 months of solitary confinement. James Burgess and William Tester, who had violated the trust placed in them as railway employees, received far harsher sentences. Both were sentenced to 14 years of penal transportation to Australia. In the harsh calculus of Victorian justice, betraying one's employer was considered more serious than simply being a thief. The sentences, however, were not fully served. Burgess and Tester both received conditional pardons after serving only 5 years in Australia. They had cooperated with authorities after their convictions, providing additional information, and the colonial government saw no benefit in keeping them imprisoned indefinitely. Both men eventually returned to England, their names forever associated with one of the greatest crimes of the century. Edward Agar's fate was more complicated. Though he had cooperated extensively with the prosecution, turning state's evidence against his former Confederates, he was still a convicted criminal facing transportation for the forgery charge. Nearly a year after the trial of his co-conspirators ended, Agar was transported to Australia, where he served 10 years before receiving a conditional pardon. Upon his release, rather than returning to England, he traveled to Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and there he disappeared from the historical record. Whether he reformed and lived an honest life, returned to crime under a new identity, or died in obscurity, we will never know. The Great Gold Robbery of 1855 left a profound impact on railway security practices throughout Britain. The Southeastern Railway, embarrassed by the revelation that the theft had been an inside job facilitated by gaps in their procedures, completely overhauled their security protocols. The practice of using only one lock on the safes, despite both being available, was immediately ended. New procedures were implemented for tracking and controlling keys. Background checks for employees with access to valuable shipments were enhanced. The entire industry learned from the railway's mistakes, but the robbery's influence extended far beyond practical matters of security. It captured the public imagination in a way that few crimes before it had managed to do. This was not a crime of passion or violence. No one had been hurt. No threats had been made. Instead, it was a crime of intellect and planning, of patience and precision. Pierce, Agar, Burgess, and Tester had looked at a system designed to be impregnable and found its weaknesses. They had exploited not technology, but human nature, the tendency to cut corners, the willingness to trust long-serving employees, the assumption that procedures written on paper would actually be followed in practice. The story of the robbery became a legend, retold in pubs and drawing rooms, in newspapers and penny dreadfuls. In 1960, it became the subject of a television play featuring Colin Blakely as Pierce. In 1975, the American writer and director Michael Crichton published a novel called The Great Train Robbery, which dramatized the events. 4 years later, Crichton adapted his own novel into a feature film titled The First Great Train Robbery, starring Sean Connery as William Pierce, Donald Sutherland as Agar, and Leslie Ann Down as a fictionalized version of Fanny Kay. The film took significant liberties with the historical facts, adding action sequences and romantic subplots that never occurred. But it captured the essential appeal of the story, the impossible made possible through cleverness and daring. Yet, beneath the romance and adventure, the Great Gold Robbery was ultimately a human tragedy, and that tragedy centered on Fanny Kay. She had been brought into the orbit of these criminal men through no choice of her own. She had been introduced to Agar by Burgess when she was working as a railway station attendant, a respectable working-class job. She had fallen in love with a man who presented himself as wealthy and successful, not realizing that his wealth came from crime. She had borne his child, making herself completely dependent on him. And then she had been abandoned, first by Agar himself when he took up with Emily Campbell, and then by Pierce, who had promised to provide for her and her child, but who had instead stolen everything. When Fanny Kay walked into Newgate Prison to speak with the governor, she was not acting out of patriotic duty or moral revulsion at the crime. She was a mother protecting her child, a woman scorned seeking revenge against men who had used and discarded her. Her decision to inform on the gang was born of desperation and rage, entirely human emotions that we can understand, even if we might not condone the actions that led to that moment. She received no reward for her information, no financial compensation for destroying the lives of the men who had destroyed hers. She simply returned to obscurity, raising her son alone, forever marked by her association with one of the century's most notorious crimes. Edward Agar, sitting in prison after his conviction for forgery, had asked Pierce to do one simple thing: take care of the mother of his child. It was not an unreasonable request. Pierce had Agar's own money, £3,000 that had nothing to do with the robbery, money that Agar had earned through other crimes before the gold theft had even been conceived. All Pierce had to do was give Fanny Kay what was rightfully hers and Agar's. But Pierce's greed overcame whatever loyalty or honor existed between the thieves. He kept the money for himself, perhaps thinking that Agar, bound for Australia and a life of penal servitude, would never be able to exact revenge. Pierce's betrayal set in motion the chain of events that destroyed them all. If he had kept his word, if he had provided for Fanny Kay as promised, the crime might never have been solved. The police had no leads, no suspects, no theories that came close to the truth. The reward money had generated no useful information. The passage of time was working in the criminal's favor, not against it. Every month that passed made it less likely that the case would ever be resolved. But Pierce's greed gave Fanny Kay both the motive and the opportunity to destroy him, and she seized that opportunity with both hands. There is something almost Shakespearean in the way the great gold robbery ultimately unfolded. The crime itself was a masterpiece of planning and execution, a testament to human ingenuity and the power of patience. But the criminals were undone not by brilliant detective work or technological superiority, but by the most ancient and powerful forces in human experience: love betrayed and promises broken. Agar loved Fanny Kay enough to want his child provided for, even as he faced transportation to the other side of the world. Pierce loved money more than he valued loyalty, and Fanny Kay loved her child more than she feared the consequences of becoming an informant. The gold, that most precious and sought after of metals, had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Men had risked their careers, their freedom, and ultimately their lives for it. They had planned for over a year, taking impressions of keys, making trial runs, stockpiling lead shot, preparing every detail with meticulous care. They had executed their plan flawlessly, carrying out a robbery that experts declared impossible, substituting lead for gold so skillfully that the theft was not discovered until the boxes were opened in Paris. They had defeated locks made by John Chubb, the premier locksmith in England. They had fooled the Southeastern Railway, the French authorities, the British police, but in the end, none of that mattered. The gold was recovered from beneath Pierce's pantry steps. The American Eagle coins were traced back to the money changers who had exchanged them. The evidence of melting gold was found at Cambridge Villa, and 3 men who had thought themselves clever enough to get away with the perfect crime found themselves standing in the dock at the Old Bailey, facing the judgment of 12 ordinary citizens who saw them not as criminal masterminds but as common thieves who had betrayed the trust placed in them. As the years passed and the convicted men served their sentences, the gold itself returned to circulation, melted down and reformed, its identity as stolen property erased. Gold is remarkable that way. It can be stolen, hidden, recovered, and melted, but it never loses its essential nature. The same atoms that had sat in those wooden boxes on the night of May 15th, 1855, still exist somewhere today, perhaps in jewelry, perhaps in bank vaults, perhaps in electronic components. The gold endures, unchanged and unchanging, while the men who stole it and the men who recovered it have long since turned to dust. The true cost of the great gold robbery cannot be measured in pounds or shillings. Yes, the bullion dealers lost £12,000 worth of gold, though much of it was eventually recovered and returned. Yes, the Southeastern Railway suffered reputational damage and had to invest in improved security measures. But the real cost was paid by people like James Burgess, who threw away 14 years of honest service for a few £100 and ended up in a prison colony on the other side of the world. It was paid by William Tester, who had ambitions of advancement and respectability, but who died known only as one of the great gold robbers. It was paid by Edward Agar, who spent 10 years in an Australian penal colony and then lived out his days as an exile in Ceylon, never able to return home. Most of all, it was paid by Fanny Kay and her son, who bore no responsibility for any of the crimes, but who suffered the consequences nonetheless. Her name became forever linked with the robbery, appearing in newspaper accounts and court transcripts, her private shame made public. The son she was trying to protect grew up knowing that his father was a transported criminal, that his mother had informed on criminals to save them both, that his very existence had been the catalyst for one of the great criminal trials of the Victorian age. We do not know what became of that child, whether he thrived or struggled, whether he carried the weight of his parents' choices throughout his life, or managed to forge his own identity separate from their legacy. There is a profound irony in the fact that a crime celebrated for its cleverness and daring was ultimately solved not through investigative brilliance, but through the most human and understandable of emotions. A woman protecting her child, a man betrayed by his partner seeking revenge. These are the threads that run through every culture and every age, the universal experiences that Shakespeare wrote about and that still resonate today. The elaborate key impressions, the trial runs, the precise weighing and substitution, all the technical mastery that went into the crime, in the end meant nothing compared to the simple truth that humans cannot be trusted to honor their promises when money is at stake. And so, when we ask who did it when gold disappears on a train, the answer is both simple and complex. 4 men did it: Pierce, Agar, Burgess, and Tester. They planned it, they executed it, they profited from it, but in a deeper sense, they were undone by forces they could not control and did not understand. They were undone by their own character flaws: Pierce's greed, Agar's tendency to abandon the women in his life, Burgess's resentment, Tester's ambition. They were undone by the invisible bonds of human relationships, the expectations and obligations that exist between people, especially between parents and children, between partners, between friends and confederates. The great gold robbery teaches us that no crime is truly perfect, because crime requires the cooperation of imperfect human beings. It teaches us that the cleverest plan can be destroyed by a single act of betrayal. It teaches us that the love of a mother for her child is more powerful than honor among thieves. And it teaches us that the consequences of our actions ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or control, affecting not just ourselves, but everyone connected to us. On a spring evening in 1855, 3 boxes of gold left London Bridge Station. By morning, that gold had vanished, replaced by bags of lead shot in what seemed like an impossible act of criminal magic. But there was no magic, only careful planning and human weakness. And in the end, the gold was recovered. The criminals were caught and punished, and justice, in its imperfect Victorian form, was served. Yet the real story, the one that lingers long after the facts have been recorded and the sentences served, is not about gold at all. It is about a young woman named Fanny Kay, standing in the office of the Newgate prison governor, choosing between silence and survival, between loyalty to men who had betrayed her and protection for the innocent child sleeping at home. In that moment, she made the only choice she could make, and in doing so, she brought down an empire of thieves. That is the heart of the story, the emotional truth that gives it power across the centuries. The gold was just metal, valuable, but ultimately meaningless. The human cost, the shattered lives and broken promises, those are what matter. Those are what remain.